Hi everyone, my name is Henrik Fahraeus and I'm a game designer and project lead at Paradox Development Studio. Now before I begin, please turn off your ringtones and such on your mobile phones. You know the drill. I'm here today to talk about emergent stories. And more specifically, emergent stories in a game I designed called Crusader Kings II. This game turned into a real sleeper hit for the studio, and it made quite a splash. Well, not that kind of splash, but mostly for the strange stories that it tends to generate. So the question is, can you create drama without a plot? Well, real life has no plot. It manages to create plenty of drama, and tears and laughter, without any team of talented scriptwriters. Although sometimes I wonder about my fiancée. So Crusader Kings II tries to mimic real life in a sense, producing stories with neither plot nor script. And I will talk about how that's done. And I will also talk about the role that more traditional forms of narrative can fill in open-ended type games like Crusader Kings II. And also how written and emergent stories can actually exist in harmony, even strengthening each other. Now, the concept of emergent gameplay in general has been almost an obnoxious buzzword in the industry for a couple of years. And there have been many talks about it here at the GDC. But I will focus on that subset called emergent narrative. That is, the unwritten stories that can appear out of the simulation itself. So why is this idea so enticing? Well, first I need to give you some background on that. There are, at least according to me, essentially 4 different ways of telling a story. Now there are many ways of defining this, but I prefer these. There's the linear story, the linear written story, which is essentially like a book, a play, or a movie. It's written down, and it's forever unchanging. In a game, the player can usually delay the acts, but they will happen, and they will happen in sequence. And this is probably the most common form of storytelling in games, in anything from shooters like Gears of War to adventure games like The Secret of Monkey Island. Then you have the branching type of storyline. This is also written down, but it typically gives the player certain predetermined choices he can make at certain points during the story, which branches out like a tree. A classic example of this would, of course, be the old game books, where you made choices by turning to a specific page. And in computer games, we've seen this, or video games as well, quite a lot. In anything from, Mass Effect to Fallout. It's a bit rarer in the main plot, but you still see it. Then you have the improvised story, which is, in real life you have improv theater, role-playing, pen and paper, role-playing, storytelling. And in computer games, it's represented by MMOs, like EVE Online, and also virtual worlds like Second Life, of course. I guess you could say this is also emergent in a way, but it requires other players. So I've chosen to split it up. Then we have emergent storytelling. And this relies on a complex simulated world. And if you make your simulation right, stories might appear, typically with the aid of AI agents or AI actors. And this is where games like Crusader Kings II fits in, and also huge blockbusters like The Sims. So why is emergent narrative so alluring and enticing? Well, it's basically because of replayability. In linear games, you play through them, then you've played it, you're done with it, you might return to it to see it one more time or a couple of more times if it's really great. Branching stories allow for a few more playthroughs to see what you missed, but still, it's limited. And of course, improvised stories require other players, which is a limitation. It's not to everyone's tastes to be creative. Thus, if you can achieve emergent narrative, it could allow for even single-player games that you can play over and over and over again for a very long time. Of course, there are many ways of stimulating and satisfying in computer and video games. Solving puzzles can be pretty addictive, and shooting people in the head as well. So let's take a look at Crusader Kings II and how it manages to create crazy emergent stories. In case you're not familiar with Paradox Development Studio, the games we make are typically grand strategy games, typically the entire world. They're historically accurate. The starting position is typically very historical. You play as the spirit of the nation, essentially, and they're open-ended, free-form, sandbox-type games where you set your own goals. They're very complex. Many people will probably say they're pretty hardcore, but we like to say they're complex but not complicated. They're pausable real-time, they're not turn-based, and you can play up to 32 people together in multiplayer. So, in 2002, when we decided we should make a game that covered the Middle Ages, basically the 11th to 15th centuries, we decided it shouldn't be a grand strategy game so much as a kind of strategy RPG hybrid. Sadly, the game was kind of stuck with a bad name. It's not primarily a game about the Crusades, although they do feature in the game. What it really is a Game of Thrones. And that's the name I would have picked if it had been available. Now, George Martin's books were, of course, a huge inspiration for us. And so were 80s classic computer games like The Lords of Midnight by Mike Singleton, and also The Sims. So basically what you get when you combine these concepts is Crusader Kings. This is a screenshot from the original game, which was released in 2004. In Crusader Kings, you play as a Christian feudal lord, anyone from a lowly count to basically the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Your character will age and die, and when that happens, you need to have an heir to keep playing. So you have like generations of characters, like in The Sims. So you need to look out for your dynasty, your house. You need to marry sensibly, have children, and acquire more power and land. And there are multiple ways of achieving this, through war, or through murder, or through diplomatic means. Characters have rudimentary skills and attributes, and for some reason also curiously big noses. When the game was released in 2004, it didn't really turn a huge profit for the studio, for many reasons, I would say. So it was far less successful than our other franchises like Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron. And none of us really thought in terms of emergent gameplay or emergent narrative. But I think that was probably what we were always instinctively aiming for with our games. However, when it came time for me to head up the sequel, Crusader Kings II, I had a much clearer idea on how to capitalize on these concepts and to strengthen the emergent storytelling. So I was pretty clear on these things. I wanted to increase the character focus, because I don't believe that the story of a nation can ever be as engaging on a personal level as that of characters. So we ditched many mechanics that we had left over from Europa Universalis, such as relations between countries. And in Crusader Kings II, the only way of securing an alliance is through marriage. So you need to marry off one of your daughters, for example, to secure an alliance. Characters should have personality traits and opinions that fundamentally matter. And by that I mean that the AI needs to act in accordance with its personality and its opinions. I really wanted to strengthen the story-generating mechanics so that everyone from human-controlled players to AI landless courtiers should have an agenda that they would strive to achieve. And there should be ruthless conflict. And in this atmosphere, stories should tend to appear, or so I hoped. I also believe strongly in order out of chaos, and I believe that chance can be a very powerful creative force. So there are many random events in the game that can throw a wrench into your intricate plans and thus spice your story up. Of course, we also made many other significant improvements to the game, so that we actually added a map that is beautiful and actually looks like a contemporary computer game. As you can see, the characters in Crusader Kings II actually have pretty small and normal noses. So let's examine how some of these stories in Crusader Kings II might appear. Our players love to come to our forum and basically post their own experiences and stories. And they usually do this in a very verbose, complicated form, like a little novella or a short story. Some of them can even be hundreds of pages long. So here's a story I've tried to reduce to the bare minimum, point by point. This player had started out as a lowly count in Finland. And he eventually managed to create the kingdom of Finland. So he was now the king of Finland. And then this little story played out. King Mielius, that is the player, had 4 sons. And he gave them all titles, so they became his vassals. So that's a player action. Then the old king dies. By chance, of course, he was old, so it was more likely. So the player is now the oldest son, Lalli. But the second son, Prince Urho, is a very ambitious character, and that's a personality trait that they can have in the game. So the AI decides to start a civil war for the throne. Of course, having a reason to do so as well, being a claimant to the kingdom. Lalli, the new player character, dies in the dungeons of his brother. Losing the civil war, of course. Now, that's something that can happen in the game, and it's not game over just because that happens. So the oldest son of old King Mielius is now the new king, and the player is his vassal, still holding on to a few counties. Lalli had an heir, Miemo. So the player is now basically the grandson of the old king Mielius. But it's a young man. So the player decides to start a civil war of his own, taking a page from the book of his uncle. But he loses, is imprisoned, and beheaded by his evil uncle. And the reason the AI does that is, again, it has the personality traits, so it basically hates this character. Now something very interesting happens. The player becomes Urho, because Miemo was young and had no children of his own, so his heir was actually his uncle. And this is a mechanic we agonized over a lot, whether we should allow this or not. Should you be able to become your own killer? Well, it makes for kind of fun gameplay. And it also makes the life of the player a little bit easier. So the player is now Urho, the possessed. That's his nickname. And he has 5 sons of his own. And the AI has given these, or most of them at least, land as well, which is always a dangerous thing. But his oldest son can't wait to inherit the throne, so he probably has his father assassinated. Urho dies in a strange, suspicious accident. And what happened here, although the player can't tell for sure, is that the son, or possibly his ambitious wife, actually arranged to have Urho killed. So another round of civil wars ensue, and more sons and grandsons of King Mielius perish one by one. And in the words of the player, this is not a tale of how I lost my ruler in a dramatic way. No, this is a tale of how I lost my dynasty, for they are beyond redemption now. I am certain that House Hämäläinen is cursed. Akko, save me. And Akko is one of the pagan gods in the game. Now, in this little story, pure chance... The player didn't lose this game, but he had decades of memorable and quite dramatic civil wars to deal with. This is a fairly typical example of a story in Crusader Kings II. There are no really random elements here. It could have been avoided. For example, it's not really a good idea to give land to an ambitious second son. Frequently, however, chance tends to spice things up even more, allowing players to imagine the most complex and fateful stories. And here's a simple example of that. The King of Norway has a pathetic son and heir. He has the craven, shy, and slothful personality traits. So he's a complete wastrel. And then, perhaps fortunately, he dies of consumption. But not after siring a genius son of his own. So the king gives his grandson the best education he can arrange. And that's something you can do in the game. You can educate children so that they pick up the best personality traits and skills. But the kid comes down with pneumonia at age 16. Now, being zealous, the king gets a scripted event that he can pray for the life of his grandson and heir. And the player also, in his own imagination, begs God to take the life of the king rather than the grandson. But this is not scripted in the game. So the grandson recovers, possibly due to this scripted event, and 2 days later the king actually dies by pure chance. So the player writes, no console was involved, so it was actually a bit creepy and a bit heartwarming in a way. Now, here, pure chance contrived to make this story interesting and memorable for the player. The king dying in response to his prayers was not really part of the gameplay at all. And here's the interesting thing. Like in the real world, these stories are only perceived by the human mind, right? The game doesn't detect or react to these stories. It doesn't matter how meaningful they seem to us. There isn't even a descriptive summary, and still players go through the effort of writing them down on our forums. It is fortunate that the human mind is so very good at seeing patterns, even patterns in time, like sequences of events, which on their own are not very meaningful. Even single, isolated events can take on great meaning for us. I mean, just think of an omen, like a black cat crossing the road. On a related note, players amuse themselves by trying to reverse engineer what they believe are really clever formulas and AI behaviors in our games. And they go to the forum and they try to figure this out. And in reality, it's just a roll of the die. So we can capitalize on that human tendency to put meaning where there is none. So how exactly does this happen? Well, as I briefly mentioned before, the secret lies in the mechanics of the simulation. But it's not enough to offer a complex simulation. After all, real life offers the most complex environment imaginable, and yet most of the time it's quite dull and uneventful, for which we should all be grateful, right? We make computer games. So complexity is necessary. But so, I would argue, is conflict. Most writers would agree that any good story requires conflict. And that's why CK2 is intentionally designed to cause strife and conflict among its many characters. There are thousands of characters, each fighting over the same limited resources in a changing dynamic world. So if you were to reduce the story-driving mechanics to its very basics, it comes down to the quantity of agents. And there are many. In fact, there are probably tens of thousands of AI characters at any given point. And they're all interacting with each other. Quality of agents. As I mentioned, all characters have distinct personalities and opinions of each other. And these determine the AI behavior. So characters can be slothful, cruel, ambitious, zealous, charitable, and so on. There are limited resources in a game. After all, it's a strategy game. Now, this being a medieval game, this is in the form of land, territory. Characters fight to gain more power by gaining more territory. Changing conditions is important, or some form of dynamism. Characters will grow old and die, and they need to produce an heir to keep playing. And the next generation of characters will have a completely new set of opinions of each other and carry new grudges and have new personalities. Your own character might be a genius or a complete moron. You never know. There has to be multiple courses of action, or perhaps it would be better to say multiple ways of achieving your goals. This is not just good for the player. Good gameplay requires meaningful choices in a game. But it's good for the AI to have an outlet for its personality. So a belligerent and warlike character can wage war to gain its titles or its goals. A diplomatic character can marry into titles, and a backstabbing bastard might choose to just murder someone, right? So there has to be multiple courses of action. And there has to be repercussions of your actions. The AI characters in the game need to react to you. So, for example, if I try to murder someone and I'm discovered doing that, the appropriate characters need to be upset. His close family members probably hate me the most. But the church will also hate me, and pretty much everyone else for being such a bastard. And lastly, my favorite, dubious morality. Conflict is great, but taking a cue from soap operas, there are other ways of generating drama. Everyone loves misbehavior, and that's why we allow some fairly dark and shocking things in this game. But then again, after all, it is the medieval ages. So, AI characters are key. So let me expand a little bit on that. Every single non-player character in Crusader Kings II has a kind of AI. It will act to achieve its goals, very much like a human player would. Unless they have a rare combination of personality traits, like craven, content, and just and honest, it will compete with the player for more power. Most of these personality traits have hidden numerical values in certain categories, like zeal, greed, ambition, and so on. And the AI just adds these numbers up so it can drive its behavior. So a character that is highly irrational, by, for example, being insane, which is a personality trait, will act with a high degree of randomness. And a zealous character will tend to wage religious wars and will harass people of the wrong religion, heretics, and so on. The other driving force of AI behavior is the opinion system. All characters have opinions about all other characters, and for very clear reasons. The opinion system is a simple integer from -100, which is complete hatred, to +100, which is basically best friends forever. And together, the personality traits and the opinions of a character will drive its behavior. And this goes from anything from its choices in the scripted events to its diplomatic actions. Now, coming from the strategy game genre, as I do, it seems so natural to fill a game with AI actors. each pursuing their own goals, just like a player would. However, it's a very rare thing to see this in other genres. And this is only highlighted by the role-playing elements of Crusader Kings II. What if there were other actors actually moving around in a game like Skyrim? Not just exploring and looting like the player, but also trading, mining, taking over cities. And what if you could actually have them as your companions and minions and give tasks to them? Well, isn't that an MMO? Well, yes and no. AI actors have no feelings to hurt. They are tireless. They don't get bored. They don't chatter away about football or the latest TV show. They are there purely for your enjoyment. And more relevant to the subject of this talk, they are crucial for the emergence of stories. And no, I don't think there is a need to fear our new robot overlords. This brings us to traditional scripted narrative, which we do employ to a very large degree in Crusader Kings II, as in our other games. At mostly random intervals, when you're playing, the player will be presented with a choice. Something has happened in the game world. And your choice typically triggers another event for another character, usually an AI character in the game, which can trigger another event for another character and so on, which can create huge branching stories. But these stories are not crucial to gameplay. However, they really serve to spice things up, to help with immersion, to describe the world as you don't actually get to see it in Crusader Kings II. I believe it was Nicholas Vining of Gaslamp Games who put it that in CK2, you're essentially viewing the world from the cockpit of a 747. And that's pretty bad. So these scripted events help ground you, to make it feel like you're actually there in your castle, talking to your courtiers, raising your children. And they also serve to make it feel like if you're playing in England, you're actually in England. You might have references to Robin Hood and King Arthur and so on. Whereas if you're in Syria, you might have references to Sinbad or Ali Baba. Now, I always wanted to take this a step further, or actually a couple of steps further. I wanted to have dozens of very rare, but also very involving and deep stories in the game. Now, unfortunately, there was never time to add these. But since release, we've snuck a few in with patches and expansions. And here's the start of one of these event chains. This story is basically inspired by movies like The Omen and Rosemary's Baby, and we added it with the Sons of Abraham expansion. So basically you notice that your little toddler is making strange buzzing noises and not behaving naturally at all. At the same time, we also added an event chain where a young maiden appeared at your court and claimed to be hearing the voice of God. And this was obviously inspired by Joan of Arc. Of course, it didn't take very long for our players to discover these new event chains. And they loved them. They really loved these event chains. And I'm pretty sure they helped sell many more copies of both the expansion and the base game. And one player even had both of these event chains, however unlikely that might be, trigger almost simultaneously. And he posted about his experience on the forum. So he basically first got Joan of Arc, in his case called Lesser Fiona, the Maid of Ormond. And then soon after, his little child, Sebdan, started to behave like the Antichrist. So he basically put this Joan of Arc-like character to be the tutor of the child, hoping to redeem this evil little baby. Now, Sebdan appeared to turn out well, but when she turned 16, she still became the incarnation of evil, and her older siblings started dying off mysteriously, one by one. Of course, the player eventually became this Antichrist character, and all hell broke loose. Is this a surrender to the supremacy of scripted narrative? Well, I don't actually think so. I think that the two forms of stories, scripted and emergent, really serve to complement each other very well. Where one falls short, the other can come to the rescue. And we feel that we do not want to sacrifice player autonomy by forcing you through a scripted story. But neither do we completely want to abandon you to the powers of your own imagination. Besides, even these scripted events, in sufficient quantity and quality, can give rise to the most wickedly unexpected emergent stories. Who wouldn't want to see what happens when little Damien is brought up by the Maid of Orleans? So what if things go wrong? Surely the normal gameplay can interfere. What if your maiden dies suddenly in a battle? Well, sometimes we try to safeguard against these things by perhaps marking a character as being immortal for a while. But normally, we don't really care. Because these scripted events are subservient or subordinate to normal gameplay. And if you have enough of them, it won't be that bothersome. So when we write scripted events, it's very important to remember that you want to avoid dull repetition of the same canned material that the player has seen 1,000 times before. There need to be enough of these event chains that they still remain interesting. So this is basically the verdict for Crusader Kings II. I had high hopes that this game would reach a new and broader demographic. But I could never have dreamed of the level of success that the game had, and still has to this day. However, it was the definition of a sleeper hit. It was very slow burning, and the first few months of sales were not far above expectations. What essentially caused the game to take off, I believe, was the recognition that the game offered something genuinely new, mostly through the weird and wonderful stories that it tells. And both the press and our forum seem to agree that it is the emergent stories and not the military side of the game or the historical accuracy that we're traditionally known for encouraging that is the selling point. So I don't have the metrics to back it up, but my clear impression is that the crowd in the CK2 forum consists of quite different people from that of our other games. And for one thing, it definitely consists of more women, which is extremely gratifying. I had hoped that would be the case, but it actually is. And that is especially impressive, of course, for a game which is set in such a misogynist era. Now, I think the future looks very bright for emergent narrative in games. But there's no need to be a purist about this. Scripted stories will always have a place to give you that extra little bit of immersion. And as we have seen, they can even drive the emergence of other stories through complexity and pure happenstance. But there are some specific ways I would like to personally develop this concept in future games, and that I would like to see in other games as well. And one of them is quite simple. It's contextualized scripted narrative. And I guess we've all seen this in many games before. And in our case, we usually replace some words so that instead of God, it might say Allah if you're playing a Muslim character. But I think this could have a lot more mileage, and there are ways I would like to take this further. Of course, the main problem is usually localization. Then we have Emergent Detection, and this is a pretty tall order. But if the game could detect these stories as they emerge, both the environment and the AI actors could act accordingly. It could give you direct feedback, emotional music, animations, and graphics. It could chronicle these stories for you and write them down. And most importantly, the AI actors could act or react to these stories just like you do as you sit behind your keyboard laughing or crying or whatever the case might be. And of course, you could have really interesting story-based achievements. Then there is directed emergence. The game could, in theory, assist with the creation of these stories. It would not necessarily have to act like a talented dungeon master or storyteller, although that would be, awesome. But it could realistically guide events down a more interesting path, massage the random number generator a little bit. This resembles the director as seen in Left 4 Dead, and I think it's being used in a couple of indie games that are upcoming that I'm keeping an eye on. I like to think of this as the intelligent design theory of narrative. However, as I imagine Richard Dawkins might say, there is something to be said for pure chance as well, and that's the approach we took with Crusader Kings II. Now, I love MMOs, and the amount of hours that I sank into World of Warcraft is simply frightening even to this day. But I don't think MMOs are necessarily the end state of gaming. A lot of escapism is lost in a jostling crowd of other human players, where the simulation has to treat you all as equals. There will always be a need for games where you are the fulcrum and the nave around which the world turns and reacts. This would be games like, I suppose, Skyrim and Grand Theft Auto, and in my little corner of the gaming world, Crusader Kings II. But we're still waiting, I believe, for the truly massively single-player game. This would be a game with the same scope and perhaps budget as an MMO. MMOs mainly achieve replayability through sheer weight of content, of course, and also social interactions. And to match this, the massively single-player game would need to rely on procedurally generated content, probably. It will have to be open-ended. And more importantly, a great many interesting AI actors, AI agents in the game. I believe that to develop further single-player games might actually need emergent stories. It's not just a buzzword. And one proven way of achieving this is the CK2 recipe for Emergent Drama. It's open-ended gameplay, a great many AI actors, AI personalities and opinions, changing conditions or dynamism, conflict, very important, and of course my favorite, low morals. So basically what I hope you take away from this talk, if nothing else, is that emergent stories allow for enormous replayability. You should think of emergence as mimicking real life. And I don't think it's just seeing faces in things. I think that this is what stories really are. And AI actors are crucial for the emergence of stories. And I believe that scripted and emergent narrative really make best buddies. Now, this was a little bit faster than I thought it would be, so I don't actually have anything else to say. So we have more time for questions. So do we have any questions?
Hi. So with so many AI actors involved and so many variables at play, did your team struggle a lot with sort of presenting to the player like a sufficient causality for a lot of stuff that was happening in the game? Because like, with the roll of the dice and with so many things happening all at once, I can imagine that it could be very difficult to sort of portray to the player like, oh, this event happened because of this and this and this.
Right.
So did you have any sort of struggles with that, or?
So did we struggle with representing the causality of these stories in the game?
Yeah.
To be honest, no. These stories only exist in the player's mind, and the game doesn't really help them with that in any way. Although it is one way that I would like to kind of improve on the game, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the relationship system and how that's used to bring a sort of human element and human motivations, and how you developed and tested the relationships.
Right.
Because I think that's one of the crucial things about the game, is just how totally human and Sims-like it can be.
Right. So how did we develop the opinion system to mimic real, or kind of behave like real humans would? Well, I suppose we sat down and thought about each of the actions that can happen in the game and that characters can take in the game, and what repercussions they should have, and try to assign a numerical value to that. And that was mostly, we did that on feeling, and then we kind of let our beta testers determine whether the values were, made sense or were reasonable. If that answers your question.
I think one of the big breakthroughs you had was the sort of multi-dimensional opinion system. And
the multi-dimensional opinion system?
Yes, where you have the one character may like another character who totally hates her guts.
Yeah, the opinions are unilateral.
Yeah.
They're not mutual, like you see in many other strategy games. So, I can hate the guts of a character, as you say, and he might actually love me for completely other reasons. And that's necessary to have this kind of system of and love and hate and characters behaving like you expect them to behave. Because that's also very important to make this transparent to the players that this character is a backstabbing bastard, and I will notice that he behaves like that. So yeah.
Want to take this? Hey, yeah, I was just wondering, with so many different characteristics, how did you go about balancing those and make sure that one characteristic didn't overpower all the others and completely dictate what the AI characters were doing?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question to answer. So how did we make sure that the different personality values and opinion values didn't overpower each other? We didn't actually make sure that they didn't. We kind of tested it and winged it as we went along, to be honest. So we assigned values that we thought were reasonable. And the AI does behave with a fair amount of randomness as well. So sometimes, if rarely, it will act out of character. But you will notice the driving characteristics of a character in its behavior.
Okay, thanks.
Are you tracking the players behaving more than just the king or the ruler or the player character that is right now? And are you changing the gameplay based on his history? Let's say like 25 characters back, he was more focused on something, and you are changing the gameplay based on it? Or is it just the one character he's playing right now?
Could you kind of condense that down or repeat it a little bit?
Yeah, I was wondering if you are changing, or if you are reacting in a gameplay, inside the gameplay, anyhow, based on what player was doing before. If it's just about the character, or if it's about what is player doing the most, or what is he doing.
So I take it you mean that our opinions based on your behavior through time, not just singular actions. Normally, no, because the characters age and die, and new characters take over. We normally feel that it's enough that they hate your current character or love him for his actions. And then, when your heir takes over, it's kind of a clean slate. And that works surprisingly well, I would say. It feels kind of natural. Although, yes, something like a blood feud or something would be interesting as well.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Hey, so how do you reconcile the very common and natural, I think, goal orientation of players who want to optimize and win and achieve a victory with the inherent randomness that you're talking about that drives these stories? Because they're very dramatic, but I can imagine players really not feeling good about a situation where they're building up their family, and then half them just die from consumption, and Uncle Herzog murders everybody or something.
Right.
You become Uncle Herzog, and it's like your whole
Right.
whole goal of what you're going for has just been dashed by the random number generator. It's dramatic, and it makes a great story when it's told, and I'm struggling with this as well in my own game. How do you reconcile that with players who want to optimize and win and master the system?
Right. So how do we accommodate players who want to basically win and play the optimal way in this system where random shit happens?
Yes. and especially in a fiction where there really is no victory ultimately, because it's all just people in the muck stabbing each other in the back.
It's a very fascinating question, and it's also very hard to answer.
Yeah.
But basically, players, they get to understand that that's not what this game is about. And you have to remember also that normal gameplay really is at the core of the game experience, though. So if you're skilled, you can avoid most of these things. And you can make sure that you have other heirs to take over. Cousin Eric is still there. Or the fifth cousin Eric. As long as he is of my dynasty, there is someone to take over if I die. And you can make sure of that. And similarly, you can avoid pissing people off and being assassinated prematurely and stuff like that. So there are ways for the min-maxers as well to play the game. And I would say it's actually probably a little bit too easy for some of these people to conquer the world.
But does that mean that the better you are at the game, the duller the stories are?
Paradoxically, probably yes. But I think that part of the problem with that is we don't have enough of these, shall we say, event chainlets or something, scripted events that will spice things up, even for experienced players. But it's definitely something we're struggling with as well.
All right, thanks.
I have trouble keeping George R.R. Martin's characters straight because there's so many of them. I'm wondering if you have a sense of how many characters can your players keep straight, and what do you have to do to help them remember who's who, and whether this second son of the Duke of somebody or other is somebody they met before or they're just encountering.
So how do we lift the interesting characters to the forefront or mark them as special interest to the player? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, it could be. I'm just wondering how you help them keep track of 10,000 NPCs or
Right. Well, we have some systems where you can mark characters as being of interest. And then you kind of get the events that happen for them. So you can listen in on what's going on for these characters. And they're also listed in a little widget we have. And you can click them and see what's going on. So we do try to make that easier for the player. But it is a problem, and as your family grows, it can soon consist of hundreds of characters. So.
Hi, you touched upon MMOs and how you believe that single-player games will soon feature the all-immersive worlds where basically characters will be able to interact with the AI and build their own world. But I've seen that before, for years and years, people have been attempting to build MMOs with your emergent storyline. And I've also seen basically not promising, but attempting to structure a game with thousands of emergent storylines, but ultimately failing or scaling down these events at a multiplayer level. Could you touch upon why do you think these challenges are coming up and what can be done to either reduce them or basically just change the way that game developers think about making these emergent storylines in a multiplayer setting with players, but also the AI being much more involved?
So you're basically asking me why have the MMOs that have tried to employ emergent storytelling essentially failed? Is that the question?
Yes.
And why?
In a sense, yes.
Well, MMOs are another kind of ball game, and I haven't personally thought much about what you could do. I would actually prefer a a massively few-player game, where there are perhaps 10 or 100 players at the most, and you would employ a lot of AI minions to do the dull tasks for you, the things that players don't want to do. So you would have them riding convoys and carrying out your orders, and not relying on other players who kind of had to claw their way up through the hierarchy,
Yes.
which I don't like with some MMOs personally.
Well, that's actually what this. There were games that attempted to have a guild system where majority of things having to do with mining, convoys, trading had to do with the AI, and you giving your tasks like an RTS, and then the player just taking care of the fun parts, which is combat or anything, intrigue or
Right.
something like that. They never were able to sort of implement them, and I just thought that maybe you had some sort of ability. Or expert
I have
opinion
special
on the matter.
abilities. I can answer all your questions. No, that's a tricky one. But I do believe that single-player games can have that type of gameplay with minions, basically, and AI characters, and it could work. I'm sure of that much. So.
Hi. I had a question about the opinion system that goes from -100 to 100.
Right.
So you mentioned earlier that -100 is kind of like hatred, and +100 is like best friends for life.
Yeah.
Something that a lot of other strategy games do is kind of chunk that number up to the player. So it's like the player hates you, or the player is kind of indifferent towards you, or the player likes you. I think that you guys have made a really interesting choice in that you kind of expose the raw numbers to the player. But I was wondering if you kind of had any thought process while you're developing CK2 about, like, what does -30 feel like to a player? Because I felt like when I was playing, like, I felt like I could come up against a threshold of, okay, this person's probably getting pissed off enough at me to backstab me. And I was wondering if there was like a linear relationship between, -30 is twice as bad as -15, or like if you roll the dice, if you weight the dice more depending on how far out you go.
Right. So your question is basically, we choose to expose these numbers in their raw form to the players, and whether we have thought about presenting them in a more, shall we say, role-play fashion.
I guess, yeah, and what your thought process was on that and why you came down the way you did.
Right. No, it is another kind of design choice that we've agonized over a bit, and in some of our games, we do present them as a text string or something, that they're indifferent, or it might say maybe, or yes or no, or something. But in this case, we felt, and I guess it ties back to the players who want to play to win, and the min-maxers, that we need to expose the raw numbers. Mm-hmm. And the same goes for some of the AI reasoning when you're suggesting a diplomatic action. If I'm proposing a marriage, you actually see why they will or won't, and we're exposing that to the player as well. And I think it works for Crusader Kings II, but maybe not some other games.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Hi, my question deals with how the story system interacts with the actual game mechanics of the raw game. But I want to let you know where I'm coming from. Last year I released a game called 7 Grand Steps, which is about family generations through history. Yep. And I wanted to make sure that a lot of the storyline was kept being tied into the mechanics, but as I added more and more sort of like features, like if you spend resources on your children evenly, they come out liking each other a little bit more. If you spend them unevenly, they're more in conflict. And I wanted to add another system where, like, how you treat your children, where they're going to make them work or play or just teach them raw. If you're like really obsessed with one of them, they kind of like grow up like resenting you, But as I added more systems, it became where it was a clear path to what the optimal min-maxing was to play the game. And I was curious how you guys felt about the relationship between the narrative and and how it affects the actual mechanics of the underlying war game, right? If you saw any real issues, or how you separate how much effect the narrative has on the game itself.
All right. So, first of all, I love 7 Grand Steps. It's a great game. It's a very odd game. It's very great. So if I understood you correctly, it's like, how did we avoid the scripted events from affecting the game too much or too little?
Yeah, too much.
Right,
I mean,
too much.
How did you like separate the two? Between, okay, here's clearly something that's going to affect, like maybe the genius kid, actually gives troops advantage because he may be a smarter tactician or something.
Right. It's on a case-by-case basis. For each of these events that we write, we have to think, it needs to be the effect needs to be big enough that it's still interesting. So it's not like, +1 gold or something.
Yeah,
it has to be interesting.
The Sid Meier thing, yeah.
Yeah. But still, it can't be game-changing, or it shouldn't be too game-changing at least.
Right.
So it's always, a fine balance to walk.
Okay. Thank you.
In Crusader Kings II, there's a lot of hidden values on traits and combinations of traits and some spooky actions that AI agents can take that aren't obvious to the player, as opposed to, say, Europa Universalis, where there's very few things the AI can do that the player doesn't know about. Do you feel that that's more important to the player perceiving an emergent story? And if so, how essential do you think it is that the player can't see the man behind the curtain and how things work to piece it together?
If I understood you correctly, you think that there's a lot of spooky action and hidden numbers behind AI behavior in the game? Or?
Enough so that especially, the mechanics that are obvious, like opinion, may not be obvious in their application to a more casual player. So do you think they have more room to construct a narrative that may not actually be part of the game mechanics itself?
I'm still not sure I understand the question, sorry. Could you kind of rephrase it a little bit?
Maybe I'll just try again in a minute, once I've constructed it better. Sorry.
So how do you constrict or corral which random scripted events come up? For example, one event just coming up out of context, it really doesn't make any sense with the world state how it is, or preventing Joan of Arc from showing up twice while one already exists. And do you stop? If a player gets an event once, do they never get it again in that play session, or in that entire game, or how do you restrict it basically?
Okay, so how do we ensure that the scripted events, happen when it's natural that they should happen? Well, we have a very powerful script language. And when we write these, we really have to consider things like that. So, for example, we set a global flag that the player had Joan of Arc appear. So it will never happen again during that session, in that specific case. And there could be many other things. You don't want these British events popping up in India or Syria or somewhere. And we have to safeguard against that, of course, as well.
Okay, thank you.
So considering how much people have noticed Crusader Kings II in particular and love the emergent stories thanks in part to AI actors, do you hope to be able to incorporate the emergent stories and AI actors into the other grand strategy games? And if so, how would you do it when the only real characters are the nations themselves?
Right, so the question is, do we want to take our character-based, emergent story-based system and employ that in our other strategy titles? And I think we don't, really. Crusader Kings II is the game about characters and emergent stories, and Europa Universalis is the game about the rise of nations and the Renaissance, and so on. So they're different games, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, so quick question. How did you manage to create characters that had strong personalities versus blended personalities? With so many different personality traits, you had to somehow roll the dice so that some traits take over sharply enough so that they impact the gameplay in certain ways versus having it all blended.
How did we design the traits so that some of them had a clear impact and others, well, they should all have clear impact, I suppose. Well, we had to have reasonable constraints. There are hundreds of traits in the game, but only a couple of dozen personality traits. And when we script new events and so on, we try to have metrics for how many times we've used a certain personality traits as the triggering factor and so on. So we do keep an eye on how used they are, both in the events and in gameplay. I think that's it. We don't have more time. if anyone has any more questions, you can probably catch me as I leave, or in the wrap-up room, perhaps. And remember the survey as you leave the room.